Welcome to Flashpoint UKR. I'm your host, Daniel Johnson, and in this series, we not only dig deep into the critical events of the Russian invasion, but also reflect on Ukraine's extraordinary fight for survival, a fight that echoes the resilience of humanity itself. Each time I dive into this story, I find myself grappling with questions that linger long after the episode ends. Why did this war unfold? Why does a powerful nation like Russia see Ukraine as such a threat that it unleashed untold suffering? And why, even amidst the cries for peace, must Ukraine remain defenseless in exchange for it? These are questions without easy answers, but ones we must explore together. The David and Goliath of Europe. In Eastern Europe, the war has led to significant loss of life and widespread displacement, with ongoing clashes despite multiple ceasefire attempts. Diplomatic discussions continue, but the situation remains volatile. The United Nations, along with NATO and the EU, has been heavily involved in pushing for an end to the violence, but peace talks have thus far yielded little concrete progress. The war in Eastern Europe has entered a critical phase, with ongoing clashes continuing to devastate civilian populations despite repeated attempts at ceasefire agreements. The conflict has resulted in staggering casualties, with tens of thousands of civilians killed and millions displaced, creating one of the largest humanitarian crises in modern history. The situation remains volatile, as both sides struggle to gain strategic advantages, while international diplomatic efforts falter. Ukraine recently rejected Russia's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, citing concerns that Moscow would use the pause to regroup and strengthen its military positions. Meanwhile, Russia remains steadfast in its offensive, targeting key infrastructure and maintaining pressure along the front lines. The rejection of the ceasefire underscores the deep mistrust between the two nations, making meaningful negotiations increasingly difficult. The United Nations, NATO, and the European Union have been heavily involved in pushing for an end to the violence, but peace talks have yielded little concrete progress. NATO has reinforced its presence in Eastern Europe, providing military and economic support to Ukraine, while simultaneously working to prevent direct escalation with Russia. The EU has imposed stringent sanctions on Moscow, aiming to pressure the Russian government into negotiations. But these measures have yet to produce significant diplomatic breakthroughs. The primary players in this war as Ukraine's allies with the most invested are Poland, France, Germany, Lithuania, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada. What is the potential outcome for them? Will they stand side by side with Ukraine in the event of the use of tactical nuclear escalation by the Russian Federation? Will they accept a peace agreement that is designed to appease Russia at the loss of Ukraine to Russia as a satellite nation? Let's explore the possibilities. The potential outcomes for Ukraine's key allies, Poland, France, Germany, Lithuania, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, hinge on several critical factors, including the escalation of nuclear threats, diplomatic negotiations, and long-term geopolitical strategy. NATO's strategic positioning amid nuclear escalation. The war in Ukraine has placed NATO in a precarious position, balancing deterrence against Russia while avoiding direct military confrontation. The alliance has reinforced its presence in Eastern Europe, deploying additional troops and air defense systems to Poland, Lithuania, and Romania. NATO's strategy hinges on deterrence through military readiness, ensuring that any Russian escalation, particularly nuclear, would be met with overwhelming consequences. Recent intelligence assessments indicate that Russia's nuclear posture remains ambiguous. While Moscow has repeatedly issued veiled threats regarding tactical nuclear deployment, analysts suggest that Putin is reluctant to cross that threshold due to the risk of direct NATO retaliation. However, the erosion of global arms control agreements and the absence of crisis management protocols have heightened concerns about miscalculation, a scenario where unintended escalation leads to nuclear conflict. The United States, United Kingdom, and France, NATO's nuclear powers, have signaled that any Russian use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would trigger severe retaliatory measures, though specifics remain undisclosed. The alliance has also intensified intelligence sharing efforts, monitoring Russian military movements for signs of escalation. Meanwhile, European leaders are debating whether to increase military aid to Ukraine or push for diplomatic resolutions to prevent further escalation. Latest diplomatic developments on Ukraine-Russia peace agreement. Diplomatic efforts to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia have intensified, but significant obstacles remain. The United States has proposed a 30-day ceasefire, warning that failure to comply would result in additional sanctions against Russia. European leaders, including those from France, Germany, and Poland, have convened in Kiev to discuss the terms of a potential settlement, emphasizing Ukraine's sovereignty as a non-negotiable condition. However, Russia has insisted that Western arms deliveries to Ukraine must cease before agreeing to any truce. The Kremlin argues that continued military aid gives Ukraine an unfair advantage, making negotiations impossible. Meanwhile, President Trump has expressed frustration over the stalled peace process, signaling that the U.S. may withdraw from mediation efforts if no progress is made. This shift in U.S. policy has raised concerns that Ukraine could be pressured into accepting unfavorable terms, potentially leading to a settlement that weakens its independence. Despite these challenges, Ukraine remains firm in its stance, rejecting any agreement that would turn the country into a Russian satellite state. President Zelensky has welcomed European leaders to Kyiv, reinforcing Ukraine's commitment to securing a just and lasting peace. The next few weeks will be critical in determining whether diplomatic efforts can yield tangible results or if the conflict will continue to escalate. The civilian toll continues to rise, with reports of widespread destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals. Children have been disproportionately affected, with thousands killed or injured as both sides face accusations of failing to protect non-combatants. The international community has condemned the targeting of civilian infrastructure, but enforcement of humanitarian protections remains inconsistent. Schools, which has further exacerbated the humanitarian crisis. The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine has reached devastating proportions, with civilian casualties continuing to mount as Russian aerial strikes intensify. Reports indicate that 12,654 Ukrainian civilians have been killed, including 673 children, since the full-scale invasion began. An additional 29,392 people have been injured, many suffering life-altering wounds from missile and drone attacks. The destruction of critical infrastructure has exacerbated the crisis, with 80% of Ukraine's energy grid damaged, leaving millions without reliable electricity or heating. Hospitals and schools have been systematically targeted, with 1,300 healthcare facilities and 3,800 educational institutions either damaged or destroyed. The latest wave of Russian strikes has further deepened the suffering. In Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Sumy, and Kharkiv, missile and drone attacks have killed at least 9 civilians, with dozens more injured. Rescue workers continue to search through the rubble, where phones can still be heard ringing beneath collapsed buildings. The United Nations Human Rights Office has reported a 50% increase in civilian casualties compared to the previous month, highlighting the growing intensity of Russian bombardments. In Zaporizhia, a glide bomb strike killed 1 person and injured over 40 others, including 7 children and a pregnant woman. The indiscriminate nature of these attacks has drawn widespread condemnation, with humanitarian organizations calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Despite international outcry, enforcement of humanitarian protections remains inconsistent. The UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Ukraine has labeled Russia's actions as a blatant violation of international law, yet accountability remains elusive. The International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School has been working alongside Ukrainian prosecutors to document war crimes, concluding that Russia's aerial campaign likely constitutes 4 counts of crimes against humanity and 5 counts of war crimes, including extermination. However, securing justice for victims remains a formidable challenge, as no international tribunal has yet held individual perpetrators. The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine has reached unprecedented levels, with 12.7 million people now in urgent need of assistance. The war has displaced 3.7 million individuals internally, forcing families to flee their homes amid relentless attacks. Aid organizations continue to struggle with funding shortages, limiting their ability to provide essential relief. Despite efforts by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, humanitarian access remains severely restricted in occupied territories, leaving millions without adequate food, medical care, or shelter. The destruction of civilian infrastructure has exacerbated the crisis, with over 2,000 attacks on healthcare facilities reported since the start of the invasion. Hospitals are overwhelmed, facing shortages of medical supplies and personnel. In frontline regions, emergency responders work under constant threat, as Russian drone strikes have increasingly targeted aid convoys, further complicating relief efforts. International pressure to end the suffering has intensified, but diplomatic efforts have yet to yield tangible results. The European Union and NATO continue to push for a ceasefire, yet Russia remains defiant, rejecting proposals that would halt hostilities. The United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Ukraine has warned that the situation is deteriorating rapidly, with winter conditions expected to worsen the plight of displaced civilians. Despite the mounting crisis, political divisions within the geopolitical impact of the war extends beyond Eastern Europe, influencing global security policies and alliances. NATO's future role in the region is being debated, with some European leaders advocating for increased military support, while others push for diplomatic resolutions. The conflict has also heightened tensions between Russia and the West, further straining relations and leading to an unpredictable future for the region. Despite ongoing diplomatic discussions, the path to peace remains uncertain. Ukraine's leadership has signaled a willingness to negotiate under specific conditions, but Russia's stance remains rigid, making a resolution unlikely soon. As the war drags on, the humanitarian crisis deepens, and the world watches anxiously for any signs of progress toward a lasting peace. Despite ongoing diplomatic efforts, the path to peace remains uncertain. Ukraine has expressed willingness to negotiate under specific conditions, but Russia's demands, including an end to Western arms shipments, remain a major obstacle. NATO has warned that any settlement that undermines Ukraine's sovereignty would be unacceptable, but divisions persist among European leaders regarding the best approach. While some advocate for continued military aid, others push for diplomatic resolutions to prevent prolonged warfare. President Trump has intensified his push for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, signaling a shift in his administration's approach to the conflict. After months of pressuring Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, Trump has now turned his focus toward Russia, warning of additional sanctions if Moscow refuses to engage in meaningful peace negotiations. His administration has been working closely with European allies to craft a ceasefire proposal, though skepticism remains regarding Russia's willingness to comply. Trump's diplomatic efforts have included direct engagement with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a key NATO figure who has maintained relations with both Ukraine and Russia. In a recent conversation, Trump and Erdogan discussed strategies to end the war, with Trump expressing optimism that a resolution could be reached soon. However, he also acknowledged that the U.S. may step back from mediation efforts if negotiations fail to progress. Despite Trump's push for diplomacy, his administration has faced internal divisions regarding sanctions on Russia. U.S. officials have finalized new economic sanctions targeting Russian banking and energy sectors to pressure Moscow into accepting peace terms. However, it remains unclear whether Trump will approve the package, as he has previously expressed frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin's reluctance to negotiate. Some officials argue that Trump has been overly accommodating toward Moscow, while others insist that tougher sanctions are necessary to force Russia into compliance. The European Union has taken a hard-line stance on sanctions, complicating Trump's efforts to ease restrictions in exchange for a ceasefire. EU leaders have emphasized that maintaining pressure on Russia is essential for securing a lasting peace, rejecting any premature lifting of sanctions. This divergence in strategy has created friction between Washington and Brussels, with European officials warning that any concessions to Russia could undermine Ukraine's sovereignty. Trump's approach to peacemaking has drawn comparisons to past U.S. presidents who sought to mediate foreign conflicts. While he has positioned himself as a key negotiator, his administration's mixed signals, ranging from threats of sanctions to diplomatic overtures, have left the future of peace efforts uncertain. As the war continues, Trump's ability to navigate these geopolitical complexities will determine whether his ceasefire proposal gains traction or if the conflict persists with no resolution in sight. The UN has been active in providing humanitarian aid and has called for both sides to adhere to international humanitarian law. However, political divisions within the UN and the broader international community have hampered the organization's ability to mediate effectively. The League of Arab States has expressed concern over the situation, but has limited influence in the region. The global geopolitical impact of the war has been profound, with ripple effects felt across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Countries have reconsidered their security policies, and new alliances have been formed in response to the crisis. The war has also heightened tensions between NATO and Russia, further straining East-West relations and leading to an unpredictable and unstable future for the region. Thanks for watching. If this video resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe. It means the world to me. I create content free of paywalls or sponsors as my way of sharing knowledge and contributing to society. Your support keeps this journey alive, so thank you for being a part of it. As we wrap up, I'd like to remind you that all my podcasts are rooted in internet research, history, and current events. I'm not a journalist, but a content creator sharing these stories for your enjoyment and reflection. I'm always open to hearing your thoughts or suggestions. Feel free to send me an email or share your ideas in the comments below. I also use AI tools to help with outlines and up-to-date research. This episode is part of a broader podcast, so stay tuned for more.